The day their world ended, the sky was a flat, indifferent gray. Ilara and Lyra stood on the porch of the house that was no longer theirs, the wood planks still holding the ghost of their mother's last footsteps. They were 15 years old, identical in face but not in spirit. Ilara's jaw was set like granite, her hands clenched into small, hard fists. Lyra's shoulders trembled, her eyes fixed on the worn handle of the door that had just been shut against them forever. Inside, Silas, their stepfather, was already moving furniture. He had waited a respectable month after their mother was laid in the frozen ground of the Providence Gulch Cemetery. Then, with the town's silent, awkward blessing, he had acted. He was a man who saw children not as a responsibility, but as a cost. He'd pressed a few coins into Ilara's hand, the metal cold and insulting. $20, and a folded, brittle piece of paper. "Your mother wanted you to have it," he'd lied, his voice thick with false piety. "It was her father's folly, the Blackwater lode. It's yours now, everything I am required to give you by law and decency." The decency of it stuck in Ilara's throat like a shard of glass. They owned nothing but the clothes on their backs, sturdy wool dresses worn thin at the elbows, and stout, cracking boots. Between them, they had the $20, a single-bitted axe their father had left them, and a heavy quilt their mother had stitched from 100 scraps of their old lives. It was a pathetic inventory for starting a new world. The town of Providence Gulch watched from a distance. Eyes peered from behind lace curtains. Men stopped their work to stare as the two girls stood unmoving on the edge of the property. It was a spectacle of quiet tragedy, and the community treated it as such, with a mixture of pity and a deep, abiding relief that it was not happening to them. Mr. Gable, the owner of the town's mercantile, was the only one to approach. He was a man whose opinions were as neatly stacked and priced as the tins of beans on his shelves. He cleared his throat, a sound of practiced authority. "Girls," he began, not unkindly, "that paper Silas gave you is worthless. The Blackwater is a flooded pit, a grave waiting to happen. Your best course is to take that money and buy passage on the next stage east. Find work in a factory. A place like this has no room for orphans." He saw the flash of anger in Ilara's eyes and softened his tone. "It's the sensible thing. There's no shame in it." Ilara looked at her sister, whose face was pale with shock and cold. She saw the fear there, but beneath it, a flicker of the same stubborn pride that burned in her own chest. They would not run. They would not be charity. She turned back to Mr. Gable, her voice low but clear, cutting through the cold air. "We'll need a shovel, and 100 pounds of salt." Gable blinked, his composure rattled. "A shovel? Salt? What on earth for?" "The deed is ours. The land is ours," Ilara said, as if that explained everything. She walked past him, her hand taking Lyra's, and led her sister toward the mercantile. The town watched them go, a new emotion replacing pity. It was a cold, sharp mockery. The girls were not just unfortunate, they were fools. Inside the store, Ilara laid their money on the counter. After the shovel, the salt, a sack of flour, and a few other necessities, only a few dollars remained. They had made their choice. They had turned their back on the sensible world and were walking, quite literally, into the wilderness. The journey to the Blackwater lode was a punishment. The land rose in steep, unforgiving inclines. The trail, a barely there path, choked with rock and thorny brush. The weight of their supplies was a living thing, digging into their shoulders, burning their muscles with every step. The axe, the shovel, the heavy sacks. They took turns carrying them, their silence broken only by the rasp of their own breathing and the cry of a distant hawk. The pines grew thicker, their branches clawing at their faces, and the world of Providence Gulch fell away behind them, becoming a memory of hostile, watching eyes. They walked for 2 days, sleeping huddled together under the quilt, the cold seeping up from the ground like a promise of the winter to come. The landscape was made of granite, immense, gray bones of the earth, shouldering their way into the sky. It was a place that did not care for human life, a place that endured. On the 3rd day, they found it. The trail opened into a small, bleak clearing dominated by a granite cliff face. At its base was a wound in the stone, a dark opening framed by the skeletal remains of rotted timbers. A pool of black, stagnant water filled the entrance, spilling out to create a muddy, reed-choked bog. A few rusted pieces of machinery lay half-swallowed by the earth. This was the Blackwater Lode. It was worse than they had imagined. It was worse than Gable had described. Lyra made a small, wounded sound in the back of her throat. Her pack slid from her shoulders and landed with a soft thud in the dirt. Tears she had held back for days finally streamed down her face, freezing on her cheeks. "He sent us here to die," she whispered, the words ragged. "Gable was right. We're fools." For a long moment, Ilara said nothing. She stared at the flooded hole, at the sheer, brutal hopelessness of it. The wind cut across the clearing, sharp as a knife, carrying the scent of pine and decay. Despair, cold and heavy, settled in her stomach. The town was right. Her stepfather had won. They had traded their last dollars for a grave. But then, something shifted. A deep, defiant anger burned through the cold dread. She would not let him win. She would not let this place defeat them. She walked to the edge of the black pool, her boots sinking into the soft mud. The water was unnaturally still, dark as polished obsidian. On a whim born of pure frustration, she knelt and plunged her hand into it. The shock was not of cold, but of warmth. A deep, penetrating warmth that was utterly wrong for the frigid mountain air. It was like dipping her hand into a summer river. She pulled her hand out, staring at it as if it belonged to someone else. Steam curled from her wet skin, a pale, ghostly vapor rising into the air. Lyra stopped crying, her eyes widening. Ilara plunged her hand in again, feeling deeper. The warmth was constant, rising from the depths of the earth. It wasn't just a sun-warmed surface pool. It was a spring, a hot spring. She looked from her steaming hand to the dark mouth of the mine, and then to her sister. The despair in her eyes was gone, replaced by a fierce, calculating gleam. The worthless place had a secret, and that secret was going to save their lives. The work began with a primal, desperate energy. Their first task was to move the water. Using the axe and their bare hands, they cleared a channel away from the mine entrance, digging through mud and tangled roots. Then, with boards salvaged from the collapsed entrance, they fashioned a pair of crude troughs. For days, they worked in a grim rhythm, scooping the warm water into the troughs, directing its flow downhill, away from the mine. The labor was brutal. Their hands, soft from a life indoors, blistered, broke, and bled. Their backs and shoulders screamed in protest. At night, they collapsed under the quilt, too exhausted to speak, their muscles twitching with fatigue. Slowly, painstakingly, the water level dropped. A foot a day, then another. The black pool receded, revealing not a muddy pit, but a solid rock floor, sloping gently down into the earth. The entrance to the mine shaft was revealed, a dark, arched tunnel carved directly from the granite. The air that breathed from it was not the foul, stagnant air of a tomb, but was moist and strangely warm. With the entrance cleared, they turned to building their shelter. They wouldn't live deep in the darkness, but right at the threshold, where the mountain offered its protection and the sky was still visible. Ilara, wielding their father's axe, became a force of nature. She felled young pines with a relentless, focused fury, stripping their branches and cutting them to length. Lyra, smaller but just as determined, hauled the logs to the entrance. Together, they raised the frame of a small, lean-to structure against the solid rock wall just inside the mine's mouth. One wall was the mountain itself. The other three were made of pine logs, notched crudely but effectively. The gaps between the logs were their next enemy. Wind and cold would knife through them. Near the spring's runoff, they found a thick deposit of rich gray clay. They mixed it with water and dry grasses, creating a thick, heavy mortar. For weeks, they packed this daubing into every crack and crevice, their hands caked with mud, their fingernails broken. The work was slow, monotonous, but with each sealed gap, the interior grew less wild, more contained. It began to feel like a room, not just a cave. The greatest challenge was fire. They needed heat for cooking, for the bitterest nights when even the mountain's warmth might not be enough. A fire inside a mine was a death sentence, the smoke a silent killer. But as they explored the first 50 feet of the main tunnel, Lyra noticed something. High up on the wall, a thin wisp of her own breath was being pulled upwards into a dark crack in the ceiling. It was a fissure, a natural chimney leading up through the rock. This discovery changed everything. They spent a week building a hearth directly beneath it, quarrying flat stones from the cliff face and stacking them with their clay mortar. It was the most difficult work they had ever done. Lifting the heavy stones, fitting them together, building the flue to channel the smoke perfectly into the fissure. Twice, a section of their wall collapsed. But they rebuilt it, learning from the failure. The day they lit the first fire was a day of triumph. They held their breath as a small flame caught on the kindling. A plume of smoke rose, wavered, and then, as if by a miracle, was drawn cleanly up the stone hearth and into the fissure above. It worked. Warmth radiated into their small chamber, a dry, comforting heat that pushed back the deep, damp chill of the rock. They sat before it, faces glowing in the firelight. And for the first time since their mother's death, they felt a flicker of something that resembled hope. Their systems grew more complex. They diverted a small, steady trickle from the mainspring into their shelter, carving a channel in the rock floor that led to a deep basin they had lined with clay. This was their cistern. It provided a constant source of clean, warm water that would never freeze, even in the deepest winter. But their most audacious plan was the garden. Deeper in the mine, past their living quarters, the tunnel opened into a large cavern. The air here was almost tropical, thick with humidity, and heated by the geothermal energy of the spring that flowed along one wall. It was a place of perpetual warmth, shielded from the sunless winter. It was a hidden summer. Hauling the soil was a monumental task. Bucket by bucket, they brought rich, black earth from the forest floor into the depths of the mine. They carried it on their backs in heavy sacks, their legs burning with the effort of climbing back up to the surface and descending again into the warm darkness. In the cavern, by the dim, flickering light of tallow lamps, they built raised garden beds from flat stones. They laid the soil down like a precious blanket, turning the sterile rock floor into a patch of living earth. There they planted their seeds, potatoes, carrots, hardy kale, and onions. It felt like a mad, impossible dream to grow a garden in the heart of a mountain. After 2 months of relentless labor, their food supplies were dwindling. They needed more than the forest and their fledgling garden could provide. They needed livestock. A journey back to Providence Gulch was unavoidable. Their return to the town was a silent spectacle. They were leaner, harder, their faces and hands browned by the wind and stained with dirt. Their clothes were tattered. They looked wild. Whispers followed them down the main street. They walked directly to Gable's Mercantile, the bell above the door announcing their arrival with a cheerful, incongruous jingle. Mr. Gable was behind the counter, totaling his ledger. He looked up, and his pen stopped moving. He stared at them, at their ragged appearance, a flicker of surprise in his eyes that was quickly replaced by a familiar, condescending pity. "Well, well," he said, setting his pen down. "The Folly Girls. I'm surprised to see you. I trust you've come to your senses and are ready to buy that ticket east." "We need 2 laying hens," Alara said, her voice flat, ignoring his jibe. "And a pair of nanny goats, if you know who's selling. We also need more seed, and another shovel." Gable let out a short, incredulous laugh. He leaned on the counter, a smirk playing on his lips. "Goats? Chickens? Girls, what are you building up there? A frozen farm? Nothing can survive a winter on that mountain. You're throwing good money after bad." "The money is ours to throw," Lyra said, her voice quiet but firm, finding a strength she hadn't possessed on their last visit. The transaction was conducted under the weight of Gable's disapproval. He sold them the supplies, directing them to a farmer on the edge of town who was selling his surplus goats. As they left, leading their 2 new goats on rope tethers and carrying the cackling chickens in a wicker cage, Gable stood at his door. "Don't come crying to me when you're starving in January," he called after them. "Providence Gulch has no room for fools." The name stuck. From that day on, in the town's collective imagination, they were simply the Folly Girls, and their home was the Folly Hole. Back at the mine, they built a pen for the animals in a small, dry side cavern adjacent to their living quarters. The stone walls would protect them from predators, and the mountain's warmth would keep them from freezing. The goats and chickens settled in, their gentle noises adding a new layer of life to the shelter. Their presence was more than just a source of future food. It was a comfort, a bulwark against the immense, crushing loneliness of the mountain. The body heat from the animals contributed its own small share to the warmth of their subterranean world, another interconnected piece of the system they were building, a system born of desperation and defiance. The nickname Mr. Gable had given them spread through Providence Gulch like a winter cough. In the Mercantile, over beers at the saloon, after Sunday service, the story of the Folly Girls became a piece of local lore, a cautionary tale about pride and foolishness. Men would laugh about the 2 girls trying to farm granite and live in a flooded hole. Women would shake their heads, sighing about their poor, departed mother and the tragedy of her wayward daughters. The Folly Hole was a joke, a symbol of a doomed and stubborn venture. One afternoon, a trapper named Brant, a hard man with eyes like chips of ice, came by their camp. He had been checking his lines and was drawn by the thin, almost invisible plume of steam and smoke rising from the fissure high on the cliff. He stood at the entrance to their shelter, leaning on his long rifle, a look of profound disbelief on his face. He saw their sturdy door, the neatly chinked log walls, the small pile of firewood. "Heard tales in town," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Didn't believe 'em. You really aim to winter here?" Alara, who was splitting wood, didn't stop her work. The axe rose and fell with a steady rhythm. "We do." Brant laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "This mountain has teeth, girls. It'll chew you up and spit you out. I've seen it break men twice your size. This little fort of yours, it's a coffin. You'll be frozen solid by the solstice." He shook his head, turned, and walked away, disappearing back into the pines without another word. His visit was not a warning, it was a verdict. As autumn bled into winter, the world outside began to die. The leaves fell, the air grew sharp, and the first snows dusted the high peaks. But inside the mountain, the sisters' world was constant and alive. Their days fell into a deep, quiet routine, a rhythm dictated by their own creation. Each morning began with the fire. Alara would add logs to the glowing embers, the smell of pine smoke filling their small room. Lyra would tend the animals, milking the goats and collecting the precious, miraculous eggs from the hens. The goat's milk was rich and warm, a luxury they had never expected. After their meager breakfast of oatmeal and milk, they would descend into the garden. By the light of their lanterns, the subterranean cavern was a place of impossible magic. The air was warm and humid, clinging to their skin. The green shoots of their kale and onions pushed defiantly from the black earth. They spent hours tending the beds, watering them from the warm spring, weeding, and checking the progress of the potatoes and carrots swelling beneath the soil. It was their secret summer, a vibrant world of life hidden in the stone heart of a dying mountain. Their world shrank to the circle of lantern light. They were utterly alone, but they were not idle. They mended their clothes, sharpened their tools, and planned for the deep winter ahead. They were the sovereigns of a tiny, self-contained kingdom of stone, fire, and earth. Outside, the wind howled like a hungry wolf, and the snows began to fall in earnest. But the sound was muffled by tons of granite. The mountain that was meant to be their tomb had become their shield. Their systems faced their first real test one night in late November. A pack of wolves, driven down from the high country by hunger, caught the scent of their goats. They woke to a sound that chilled them deeper than any frost, a low, guttural howling that seemed to come from all directions at once. It was followed by the frantic bleating of the goats and the terrified squawking of the chickens. Ilara grabbed the axe, her knuckles white. Lyra held a lantern high, its light casting huge, dancing shadows on the stone walls. They stood together, listening to the scratching and snarling just outside their heavy plank door. The wolves were trying to get in, throwing their weight against the wood. The door, which they had built from thick pine and barred with a heavy log, groaned but held firm. For an hour, the siege continued. The sounds of the desperate animals outside were a terrifying counterpoint to the steady, calm warmth within their shelter. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The howling faded into the distance. They had survived. Their fortress was sound. It was more than a home, it was a defense. The Great Freeze of '83 did not arrive like a normal storm. It was a conquest. It began with a sky the color of a bruise, a strange yellowish gray that silenced the birds and made the very air feel heavy and still. Then came the wind. It was not a gale that rose and fell. It was a solid wall of force, a screaming, relentless presence that never paused for breath. It tore at the trees, its howl rising to a shriek that felt malevolent, personal. Then came the snow. It did not drift down in flakes but was driven horizontally, a blinding white torrent that erased the world. It was less like weather and more like an avalanche from the sky. The temperature plummeted, dropping to levels no one in Providence Gulch had ever known. It was a cold that was a physical entity, a predator that sought out every crack, every weakness, every source of warmth to devour. In Providence Gulch, the community's confidence shattered like frozen glass. Their sturdy, conventional homes were no match for the onslaught. The wind pried at roof shingles and shattered window panes. The snow, fine as sand, was driven through the tiniest gaps in the walls, forming drifts inside their parlors. The town's preparations, designed for a hard winter, were laughably inadequate for this apocalypse. Firewood supplies, meant to last until March, were consumed in days. Families huddled together in a single room, feeding their stoves and fireplaces constantly, only to feel the cold seeping back in the moment the flames faltered. The town well froze solid, its thick oak bucket trapped in a foot of ice. Livestock, left in barns that had always been sufficient, began to freeze to death where they stood. The roof of the meeting hall groaned under the impossible weight of the snow, and then, with a sound like a cannon shot, it collapsed, its main beams snapping in the vicious cold. The town was a collection of isolated, freezing traps. Hope grew as cold as the air. 8 miles up the mountain, inside the Blackwater lode, the world was a different place. The shriek of the wind was a distant, muffled hum, a song sung in a language they couldn't understand. The tons of granite surrounding them absorbed the storm's fury, turning its violent rage into a deep, profound silence. Their shelter was not fighting the storm. It was simply outside of its reach. The fire in their hearth burned with a steady, placid flame, its smoke drawn cleanly up the fissure into the raging blizzard 100 feet above. The granite walls, warmed over months by the fire and the earth's own heat, radiated a gentle, constant warmth. The cistern was full of warm, clear water. In their pen, the goats chewed their cud placidly, and the chickens slept undisturbed. Deeper inside, in the lantern-lit garden, the green leaves of the kale were beaded with condensation, a testament to the impossible, life-giving humidity that filled the cavern. Ilara and Lyra went about their daily chores, the rhythm of their lives unbroken. They were utterly isolated from the world of men, but they were warm, they were fed, and they were safe. They had not built a house to withstand the winter. They had built a world where winter could not enter. The sound was almost lost in the deep hum of the storm, a faint, rhythmic banging, so out of place in their silent world that at first they thought it was a trick of the wind. But it came again, more frantic this time, a desperate, muffled drumming against their heavy outer door. Ilara and Lyra exchanged a look of disbelief. No living thing should be out in this weather. No one could survive it. Ilara took the heavy bar from the door while Lyra held a lantern high. With a groan of protest against the snow that had drifted against it, the door swung inward. A figure, more a shape of ice and snow than a man, stumbled across the threshold and collapsed onto the stone floor. They dragged him inside, pushing the heavy door shut against the screaming wind. As they brushed the snow from his face, their breath caught in their throats. It was Mr. Gable. His beard was a solid mass of ice. His face, where it wasn't white with frostbite, was a ghastly blue. His eyes were wild with terror and exhaustion. He gasped for air, his lungs rattling. His story came out in broken, desperate phrases. It was his daughter, his little Sarah. She was sick with a fever, and the cold had settled in her lungs. Their house was an icebox. The last of their firewood had burned to ash that morning. His wife, her face a mask of despair, had sent him out as their final, impossible hope. He was to go to the trapper, Brant, whose cabin was closer. But he'd gotten lost in the whiteout, wandering for hours until he saw it, a faint, impossible plume of steam rising from the snow-covered cliffside. He remembered the fissure the girls had found. He had stumbled toward it, a ghost of a chance, the only source of warmth in a world of ice. He lay on their floor, the man who had named them fools, the man who had led the town's chorus of mockery, now broken and begging for his child's life. For a heartbeat, Lyra's face hardened. She remembered his smug, condescending voice, the laughter in his eyes as they had left his store. She remembered the shame and anger that had burned in her chest. But Ilara looked past the man. She saw the father. She saw the desperation. She thought of the little girl, shivering with fever in a freezing house. The memory of the mockery was a bitter thing, but it was just a memory. The child's life was real, and it was happening now. Their carefully rationed firewood, their precious food, helping him would come at a cost to their own stores, a risk to their own survival. The choice was stark, but it was not difficult. She met Lyra's eyes, and her sister saw the resolve there. The bitterness in Lyra's own gaze melted away, replaced by the same quiet determination. They would help. Not because he deserved it, but because they could. They acted without a word. Lyra ladled hot broth from the pot simmering over the fire and helped Mr. Gable drink, the warmth slowly returning a flicker of life to his eyes. Ilara went to their woodpile. It was not large, but it was dry, seasoned pine, stacked neatly against the stone wall. She began to load their small, hand-built sledge. She piled it high with logs, enough to keep a fire burning for 2 days. She added a thick wool blanket and went to their root cellar, a small alcove carved into the rock. She returned with a sack of potatoes and a handful of dried herbs from their garden. Mr. Gable watched them, his eyes wide with a dawning, shattering disbelief. He had stumbled from a world of frozen death into a place of impossible warmth and order. He pushed himself up on one elbow, his gaze sweeping across their small stone room. He saw the steady fire, the neatly stacked tools, the cistern of clear water. He smelled roasting potatoes mixed with the scent of pine smoke and damp, living earth. Through the open doorway to the next cavern, he saw the goats watching him with placid curiosity. He heard the soft clucking of the chickens. His mind could not reconcile the scene with the narrative he had so confidently peddled. This was not the folly hole. This was a fortress. It was a miracle. The warmth of the broth and the fire had chased the worst of the cold from his bones. Ilara and Lyra helped him to his feet. The sledge was ready, standing by the door. As he prepared to face the storm again, he turned to them, his face, raw with frostbite and shame, crumbling. The pride that had been the bedrock of his character was gone, scoured away by the storm, and by their quiet, unhesitating grace. "We called you fools," he said, his voice thick and cracking. "I called you the folly girls." He shook his head, a gesture of profound self-recrimination. "My God," he whispered, looking around the warm, life-filled cavern. "We were the fools, all of us." Ilara simply pulled the hood of his coat up, securing it tightly under his chin. She looked him in the eye, her expression unreadable. There was no triumph in her gaze, no hint of "I told you so." There was only a grave and practical focus. "Your daughter is waiting," was all she said. They helped him pull the heavy sledge out into the blizzard, the wind immediately snatching at their breath. Ilara pointed him in the direction of the town, a path that was now a matter of instinct rather than sight. He gave them one last look, a look of awe and deep, humbling gratitude, and then he was swallowed by the white chaos. They barred the door, returning to the quiet warmth of their sanctuary, the silence filled only by the crackle of the fire. Mr. Gable and the firewood made it back to Providence Gulch. His daughter, Sarah, survived the night, and the next. When the great freeze finally broke 2 days later, leaving behind a silent world buried under a mountain of snow, the story of his rescue spread faster than fire in a dry field. It was a story of desperation, survival, and a reality so different from what the town had believed that it forced a fundamental reevaluation of everything they thought they knew about sense and foolishness. As soon as the paths were cleared, a delegation of men, led by Gable, made the trek up to the Blackwater Lode. They came not to mock, but in silent, humbled pilgrimage. They stood at the entrance, staring into the warm, ordered world the two girls had carved from the stone. They saw the gardens, green and thriving in the geothermal warmth. They saw the healthy animals, the abundant water, the cleverly designed hearth. They saw a system of survival so robust and ingenious that it had rendered the deadliest storm in memory irrelevant. The name Folly Girls was never spoken in Providence Gulch again. It died on the wind of that great storm. From then on, they were known as the Sisters of the Mountain, their names spoken with a mixture of reverence and awe. The town's relationship with them was transformed. People no longer offered pity. They came seeking knowledge. They brought trade goods, cloth, metal tools, sugar, in exchange for fresh eggs and goat milk in the dead of winter. They came to learn how the sisters had vented their fire, how they had built their cistern, how they managed to grow food in the dark. The impact on the settlement was profound and lasting. The Great Freeze had exposed the fragility of their conventional building methods. Now, inspired by the Sisters of the Mountain, they began to build differently. New homes were built with thick stone foundations, dug into hillsides to take advantage of the Earth's insulating properties. People began to look at the landscape not as something to be cleared and conquered, but as a potential partner in survival. The principles of thermal mass, geothermal advantage, and subterranean shelter, once the mad experiment of two outcast girls, became the cornerstone of a new, more resilient local wisdom. The Sisters' Mine, once the Folly Hole, became a landmark. Travelers passing through would hear the story and carry it to other towns. A legend of two young women who were thrown out with nothing and built a fortress from a worthless pit. Ilara and Lyra never sought the attention. They continued their quiet, industrious lives, expanding their home deeper into the mountain, their gardens growing larger, their livestock herds increasing. They remained apart from the town, but they were no longer outcasts. They were foundational. Years later, Ilara and Lyra, now women grown, stood at the entrance of their home on a warm summer evening. The sun was setting, painting the granite peaks in hues of orange and purple. Their home was no longer a simple shelter, but a sprawling homestead woven into the fabric of the mountain itself. Terraced gardens descended from the entrance, and the gentle sound of their animals echoed from the warm stone halls behind them. They were not defined by the injustice that had cast them out, nor by the mockery they had endured. They were defined by the warmth they had cultivated in the cold, by the life they had nurtured in the dark. Their legacy was not written in a book or carved on a gravestone. It was written in the green shoots that grew in the heart of the mountain, and in the quiet, enduring strength of stone.